friends and family and listeners to the podcast. I'm with Paul Simard today. He's calling in from Montreal. I am really excited about having him on today, particularly because one of the things I read in his bio is he's very wedded to, as he would say, counter societal ways. And I talk a lot about what we're up to here is countercultural. So I think we're a kindred spirit from that platform right there. And so he's a TED Talk speaker. He is a death doula. He is a guide and a coach for men dealing with wellness, hopefully on the wellness path. And I love this also, cultural architect. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'll just say that the cultural architect is new and didn't actually come from me. It was somebody else who said it about the work that I do. And I'll just say that, in fact, I think it's something that anybody, including yourself, who's doing this kind of work should just add to the end, because when we're exploring these things, the harder edges of life, the least spoken about, the least seen, the least comfortable parts of life, that's where architecture, that's where this culture actually is born, right? So I'm really excited to be getting involved with this. And we can talk about culture and society and how those are different too. And yeah, so many things. So grateful to be here.
Great. And obviously, just, to throw this in here is we're at this magnifying moment on, kind of all sides of what's happening in the world now. So before we kind of launch into that sort of conversation, I really love to find out what's your kind of origin story of how you came to this work of service. What are a moment or moments that you kind of point to as the beginning of kind of the hero's journey, those things that knock us on our butt or show up in ways that are just so rattling to our core that we have an opportunity to seize the adventure and the re-architecting of ourselves. So I'm curious, what's your story?
Yeah. Well, for those who want, part of my story is already available in the TED Talk. That's really what it was. And so I always, for those who feel called to please go and take that, it focuses mostly on my journey with the men's work and my own journey as a man trying to find mental health and wellness in our current context. But I would honestly say, and I believe this more and more, like it was literally in my DNA to be called into service. As it is, I think, for most of us, it's just how dominant is that? And because as an example, my grandmother on my mother's side was a volunteer nurse. My mother was a volunteer for West Island Women's Shelter and other women's initiatives and was constantly contributing to society. I was raised with sort of empathic action as a fundamental principle in our way of being, and my father gives his time to the community through sports organizations and also through the church. So this was a fundamental piece upon which my whole life was built.
Right.
I had my own journey start sort of at a young age. I was and still am, but I've grown a little bit, kind of the small kid in class. And that small projected itself onto how I saw myself in the world. I was not only just small physically, but I was small and hence unworthy in a lot of different ways. And I would write that story for myself. I would find the reasons why that was true. And I started on a young age of trying to learn more about the human experience. I read my first introduction was the Celestine Prophecy, which dates me, if nothing else, because it's a very old book. And then The Road Less Traveled and these other books. But of course, the answers may be found in the books, but we actually need to act on those things.
Right.
And so just reading the books wasn't enough. And so I may have been getting the knowledge, but I wasn't yet taking it into a place where I was alchemizing it into something that would be called wisdom that could inform my life. Until I would say the very first shock moment was sometime in around 2009. There was a situation that was happening at home with my kids and the dynamic. And I won't get into the details other than to say that I found myself late in the night, sitting outside across from my own home, wondering whether or not I was worthy of going back in and whether or not my kids would have been better off if I wasn't there. And I'm very fortunate that I have a baseline of mental health and wellness that didn't allow that exploration to go any farther than that. To me is a gift. But I remember that moment vividly. The next moment, I'll say actually in the years following that, my whole sort of persona was provider and protector. right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a white cisgendered male for those who may not be able to see us. And I was very much socialized with those two parts of the way of defining myself in the world.
Yeah.
In 2017, we're getting to the chase here. In 2017, I walked into my boss's office, and within 7 minutes, both of those things were taken away from me as I was very, very abruptly fired and found myself with no more job. And because of the socialization, I actually didn't tell any of my close, intimate community, my family, my friends, for 3 weeks. There
Wow.
were people who knew, but I was so full of shame and guilt and honestly
Mm-hmm.
fear
Mm-hmm.
that I knew I had to come up with a plan before I could actually present it to someone. Otherwise, I would be seen, or I believed I would be seen as a
Mm-hmm.
failure and unworthy. Again, there's that story, right? The
Mm-hmm.
small. And honestly, Kale, what this really led me to was doing some very interesting Google searches around what does it mean to be a father? At the time, I was still married. What does it mean to be a husband? And eventually, what does it mean to be a man? And that's when I came across this thing called men's work. And that really was the catalyst
Mm-hmm.
to everything that I'm doing today, where I not only recognized that my story wasn't unique, but that there were
Mm-hmm.
also very few resources, in fact, in a post Me Too world for men to turn to and to feel safe and to feel comfortable. This eventually led me to understanding that one of the biggest struggles men have is with limits. We are told to go past our limits, to go beyond our limits, to resist and to fight them, that they are things to be overcome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Impossible
Mm-hmm.
is nothing. I believe that's
Mm-hmm.
a Adidas or Nike, right? And that's also something that gets projected onto men. And of course, the ultimate limit is death. It's one we can't avoid, but it's
Mm-hmm.
viewed as a limit nonetheless. We say things like our health has failed, something has ended, all of these things. It's presented as a limit as opposed to something that is a part of. And that's what really drove me into the work of becoming a death doula, because especially going through COVID
Mm-hmm.
and the largest narrative there being the number of deaths and the response and the effects that that was having on people's mental health and wellness, it became
Mm-hmm.
clear to me that if we could deepen our relationship to death, if we could nourish a healthier relationship with grief and
Mm-hmm.
loss and endings, and if we could, in fact, embrace our limits, that the whole dynamic changes. And that has really led me to what I'm doing today, which leads to the beautiful compliment of somebody saying you're a cultural architect. Because I believe that through the hardest edges, through again death and grief and all of these things, we have an opportunity here to completely shift our perspective on our day-to-day way of being with each other and with ourselves.
I'm with you totally because of the work that I do, not just in the addiction loved one space, but also I'm an executive coach and business consultant,
Mhm.
and they're all humans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so being able to hold the space for some of my members, my clients that have lost people, whether it's suicide or cancer or whatever. And I do believe that this is my story right now, and I'm curious to see what your perspective is that we are experiencing obviously more and more suicides, more and more people kind of opting out. And then coupling that in the way that I think about this for my audience is that when you are a parent or a loved one who loves someone in addiction, death is your companion all the time. And so would you just speak to the redefining and of death and the redefining of grief? I just
Oh,
think those two twins are incredibly important in this journey that the loved ones are on.
you use so many of my favorite words there, Kale. So first of all, redefining, reframing. I mean, this is one of the things I think I spend a lot of my time on that is the most serving and supportive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to start with one reframe around death because again, it is viewed as an ending. It
Mm-hmm.
is viewed as a loss. I mean, our language is really important here, right?
Yes.
We stay away from death generally as the language. My mother died in 2022. That's what happened. I didn't lose her and she didn't pass away and she didn't transition either. I mean, those are all very beautiful and soft words, but at the end of the day, my mother died and there should be
Mm-hmm.
nothing wrong with me saying that and
Mm-hmm.
embracing her death. But because it is so clear in its ending energy, we resist it, right? But here's this very, very simple reframe for people. Life is literally not possible without death. It requires it. Everything we're going to eat today, everything we're going to live off of has come from the death of something. Now, we've been removed from that. We're the only creature actually on the planet, generally speaking, in the West especially, whose
Mm-hmm.
death doesn't serve. Our deaths don't serve. We go into metal containers and we're sometimes put in glass walls and we don't nourish, we don't feed anything. But for the most part, death feeds life. And so a death is required in
Mm-hmm.
the nourishment of life. So
Mm-hmm.
if we're going to celebrate life as we do, if we're going to lift it up and elevate it as this wonderful thing to be in awe of, then we must also be in awe of its source. And
Mm-hmm.
that's death. And I've really started to be saying more and more that, in fact, death is a privilege. And just from a mathematical point of view, death creates physical space for more life. From a mathematical point of view, if we don't die,
Mm-hmm.
there's not enough space, we run out of it, right? So, from
Mm-hmm.
that simple perspective, it's a privilege. You're making space for new life, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it could also be a privilege in the sense that you could actually give life. We're having more and more green ways of burial that we can lean into. But
Mm-hmm.
then also, your way of dying can become a teacher to others. And really, someone's life, its most compelling lessons get taught to us after they die. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if we live a life worth inspiring others, then it's in our death that that really comes to light. So we can teach in such a profound way through our death. Those are things that really can take a long time for people to get comfortable with in terms of reframing death. But I think
Mm-hmm.
there's some very simple ones. I love, and the one that's easier typically for more people to lean into is, and you talked about twins. So I like to look at grief and I like to look at its twin. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily even be able to see the twin. But grief's twin is love. Love and grief are twins. And it was my mentor, Stephen Jenkinson, who first introduced me to this concept. But this idea that to love someone is grieving them in their presence, and to grieve them is to love them in their absence. So when you're grieving someone, it is you continuing to love them. It is actually you finding a new way to love them
Mm-hmm.
outside and beyond the body.
Yeah,
And
so
we
let's just take this, Paul, and I'm bringing it back into the world that I was living in very personally with my son dealing with addiction. And so it based on this conversation, it feels very much like there were so many moments of grief because I thought he was wasn't who he was, and everything kept changing all the time. And to be able to love him in the midst of his suffering was an aspiration that I had.
Mm,
While I was also grieving who I thought he was going to become. And then he's not that in the midst of
right.
his addiction.
That's right. That's right. I mean, it's probably what a training ground, if I can use that language,
Mm-hmm.
for the grief that comes with death, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, that person through his addiction, through your son's addiction, I don't like the language around like rebirth and reborn, but he is certainly always changing.
Mm-hmm.
And there are parts of him that come and go and that shift and pivot with his addiction. And to a certain degree, just as you've learned to love this next version of him, something happens and there's a new form of him that is placed before you. Not like somebody changes through their life in a
Mm-hmm.
gradual progress way, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Addiction is a very sudden and an abrupt way of someone, all of a sudden appearing in a new way. And so it's not like learning to love someone gradually as they change throughout 40, 50 years. It's
Right.
something different. It requires a whole other skill set that we're quite frankly not socialized to
Yeah.
embrace.
Well, no matter what iteration he was in, I could always see who he really was. And
Right.
so being able to hang on to that clarity of knowing
Hmm.
who he really is deep inside, while
Yes.
all the crazy's going on, and I'm kind of in the midst of grieving the lives that I thought he would live and not
Mm.
knowing, like in complete unknown. It can be definitely crazy making. And at the same time, I love the way that you framed it in terms of a training ground, because honestly, if I hadn't gotten cracked wide open through that experience with him, I would
Yeah.
not be the human that I am today. I would not be doing the work that I'm doing today. And I would not be able to say to him and have conversations with him that actually bless his journey.
Right. Well, what a beautiful way to frame it too, in the sense of being a blessing,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a big part. We tend to victimize ourselves in those moments, right? And instead, here you
Mm-hmm.
are, you're turning it into something where you can actually bless his journey through your awareness
Mm-hmm.
of what's happening. And your use of the word grief here is most people would probably, and it's okay, like none of this comes with any judgment. That's really important for people to hear, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's most people would say that I'm struggling to love him through all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm struggling to like find that part of him. But when you can go beyond the current experience, when you can go beyond the physical expression of the person in front of
Mm-hmm.
you, you're grieving them, which
Mm-hmm.
means you're loving them. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same. It's just that you're
Mm-hmm.
also bringing into a very sharp awareness that that love goes beyond the physical body. Because here, especially in the West, we associate our love with the physical manifestation of the person. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why our grief only gets associated with sadness and despair and pain. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't get associated with happiness and joy and care and
Mm-hmm.
concern.
Yes.
Through your grieving him, you were
Mm-hmm.
expressing care, concern, all of the things that love includes,
Yes,
but is
and
also
it's
included.
and it's not normally talked about in terms of we can hold both in the same space.
No, no,
It's either or in a lot of
that's
people's
right.
ways of looking at this.
Yeah. Well, the grief only comes in when the loss. But I'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you right now, speaking from personal experience, because I think it's important that people understand, like, no, this is actually what's possible. As an
Mm-hmm.
example,
Mm-hmm.
as I said earlier, my mother died in 2022, and she got the diagnosis about 6 months before her death. And I can tell you, because I witnessed it, that my mom and dad spent most of that time grieving together, not finding ways to love each other, not celebrating their love, grieving, right? And not preparing for my father's grief either, grieving,
Mm-hmm.
right? Such that if you were to look at their life together a year before the news, the 6 months while they were living with her dying, and today, there's actually very little difference in what
Wow.
you would see in my father. And that's
Mm-hmm.
not because of anything that I've actually done or supported him with. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not at all, right? It
Mm-hmm.
was actually informed by my mother's way of living. And that's where I said earlier about death being the teacher. Well, that was one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that my mom did really well is she showed people how to love in the
Mm-hmm.
absence of
Mm-hmm.
something that you would rely on otherwise. So my father, and I believe this to be true, my father will grieve my mother for the rest of his life
Mm-hmm.
because he's going to continue to love her in the
Mm-hmm.
same way as
Mm-hmm.
when she was alive. And that's a gift. It's a
Mm-hmm.
blessing. So that's
Mm-hmm.
the other thing that I often say when it comes to grief. Grief is a blessing. It's a gift
Mm-hmm.
because, and let's use the example of your
Mm-hmm.
son or somebody else who might be loving somebody in addiction, right?
Mm-hmm.
The sheer opportunity of loving in that way is a gift. Many
Mm-hmm.
people don't have that opportunity. Many people don't have the opportunity to be a parent. And so they wouldn't even have the opportunity to parent a child, even one who's struggling with addiction, right? So the opportunity to grieve at all is a gift because of where it comes from and its twin, love.
Wow. So speak to me a little bit about, I've talked to so many parents who have lost children, whose
Hmm.
children have died
Yeah.
from overdoses.
Yeah.
And in so many respects, there seems to be an irretrievable part of themselves. Like they almost can't give themselves permission to be joyful again, or laugh, or be
Yeah.
happy. And so, from the framework and the knowing that you have, what's your advice?
It's hard.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the hardest things. I like to speak a lot from personal experience, and then at times we have to kind of zoom out, right? And let's look at
Mm-hmm.
society. And this
Mm-hmm.
is one of those moments because the death of a child under any circumstances is one where I believe we need to first zoom out and look at society.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I typically will walk it back in towards the family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I've also been around this environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, first and foremost, our society, especially again here in the West, it's the one that I know best. And I think that most of your listeners probably are aware of as well. But you think of when a child is born, right? You have this beautiful creature that comes out, and for the most part, there is an expectation that that child will have a long life. Now, nobody knows exactly what that means. And, my mom died at 73, and there are a lot of people who say, well, she was so young. And again,
Mm-hmm.
the way she died, which was incredible, I don't think she would agree with you, but I'm not here to speak for her. But when does it become long enough,
Mm-hmm.
right? Well, when
Mm-hmm.
it becomes full, that's another word that we use here. Okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
what does full mean and who's defining full? But the biggest challenge with all of these things is the notion of expectation.
Yeah.
And so a child is born, and there's an expectation that that child has the right to a full and long life. Again, extremely subjective,
Mm-hmm.
extremely dangerous terms, but they're so ingrained that they're actually like they have the same effect as like a knowing
Yes.
in the body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so for just coming into contact with that at first glance, that
Mm-hmm.
expectation was there,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's not soft. That is not a soft edge to come into contact with. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't diminish the death of the child. It doesn't diminish the sense of loss, but it does help people to start to understand a little bit about why it is they're feeling some of what they're feeling, because we're pointing at something that people don't often speak to.
Mm-hmm.
Again, that expectation, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We don't have to go very far back in time for it to be a place where, in a time where the percentage of children who
Mm-hmm.
made it to 10 years old, 20 years old, 40, 50 years old, like was way, way, way lower. It's modern medicine for the most part
Mm-hmm.
that has gotten us to this place, which has fed this expectation. And so there's also that our nervous systems and our epigenetics are also not primed for this expectation either, that we're
Mm-hmm.
still learning this new expectation in our bodies. So now we've got two pieces. Then we have to come into that contact again into contact with that notion again that children have been dying as long as people have been being born, and that doesn't make it okay when a child dies. That doesn't mean that we have to necessarily accept it, but it's also something that is not outside the norm for the human experience.
Yeah.
Again, if we look historically, it's been happening for time immemorial. There's a couple of other elements here, and this is where we start to zoom in on the families. So let's look at people who are navigating the death of someone following an addiction. I'm a firm believer that a large percentage of our addictions, and you would know much more about this than I would, are shaped by the context in which that person has been raised.
Mm-hmm.
Societally, familially, these addictions they're born somewhere. They come from somewhere. They're triggered from something. They're informed by something. And so one of the things that I've been saying more and more, and we're seeing it because you spoke to it, suicide rates are increasing, addiction rates are increasing, abuse rates are increasing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Physical abuse and violence.
Yeah.
These things to me are also questions, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
what was it about your child's experience that led them to come to this place where they're
Mm-hmm.
living with this addiction, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the first things that tends to lead to in my work with the families is the removal of guilt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in so many cases, my experience has been that families blame themselves, even when it's a medical condition.
Yeah.
Even when it's a medical condition, they take responsibility for the death, like they somehow failed their child.
Yeah. And I would posit that it's really more deadly to think about it through the lens of shame.
Absolutely. And so, how do
And
we
it's on both
remove?
sides of the aisle.
Yeah,
You know,
we have to uncouple
shame
them from that shame.
for sure. And shame tends to be kind of the captive of somebody who's dealing with addiction and the captive of family members or friends that love them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Because again, we still place so much of that within the individual, right? We
Mm-hmm.
have this other word that it's going to sound strange that I'm bringing it up, but it's actually very relevant. Sovereign. Well, why am I bringing up sovereign? Because
Mm-hmm.
sovereign today means you can do it on your own, means you don't need anybody, means
Mm.
you're self-sufficient,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's what sovereign means. And when you're addicted, it means you're not sovereign, right? So right there's that collapse. I can't get out of my addiction on my own. I need this thing in order to survive. This feeds that notion
Mm-hmm.
of not being sovereign. Well, first of all, that's not even what sovereign actually meant. Sovereign back in the day, that was the person who was in service to the community. Kings and queens or sovereigns. And in the old days, the kings and queens were the ultimate servants to the society, to the communities that they were sovereign over.
Mm-hmm.
It's who the villager went to when
Mm-hmm.
they needed more grain. It's when the merchant went to when somebody stole from them. They needed support from the sovereign, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we want to actually be sovereign in today's world, let us
Yeah.
learn how to lean on each other, right? So can we again uncouple the shame through the notion of sovereign doesn't mean I don't need anyone. Sovereign means I need everyone. And so
Yes.
from a parent's perspective, leaning on each other, letting their child lean on them, but
Mm-hmm.
understanding that your shame around
Mm-hmm.
that is what actually makes leaning against each other so hard.
Well, yes, and I talk quite a bit about, for me, the mommy code was such a lie. Or the daddy code is we're supposed to fix it. We're just supposed to make them better. We're in charge of them. Why can't we make them
Mhm.
stop? All of those things. And so learning how to rewrite that completely. And I love that differentiation in sovereign that you spoke to. The idea that we are individualistic in our journey in life is complete bullshit. And we are absolutely meant to be in community. And I do think that we are in a time when we're being reminded that
Yeah.
being in community is where our power resides.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and to tie all of that with what you're talking about, there's that book, Lost Connections.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember the author's
Mm-hmm.
name right now because I always get him mixed up with the guy who wrote Sapiens. So I'm not going to do that. But I believe his last name is Harar, but it's Lost Connections. And he talks about one of the most compelling and powerful sort of antidotes, if you will, or medicines for addiction and depression, isolation
Mm-hmm.
is
Yes.
connection, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so that again,
Mm-hmm.
that right there, that takes a swing at that notion of sovereignty. So can we let that shit go and embrace instead the fact that what the addict is seeking for is connection and contact? We have these challenges right now with fentanyl and
Yes.
other things that are going all over. I mean, in Canada, these things are just as bad as anywhere else in the world right now.
Yeah.
What a lot of those things do, right, is they anesthetize, right? They numb out. It's a complete numbing out. And when you actually break down the word of anesthetize, it's the suppression of beauty. That's the etymology of the word. And so because these people feel so isolated and alone, they're like, the world is almost too much for them to take in on their own. And so they're
Mm-hmm.
looking for these drugs to anesthetize the beauty of the world that is accessible to them. There's some poetic liberty there that I've taken with
Mm-hmm.
what these drugs do, but really that's what they're doing. They're shutting people down. They're trying to turn their nervous system off
Yes.
for
Yeah.
their experiences.
Yes. And what I would say is because my son at the tail end of his addiction, he's almost 3 years clean and sober at this point, but at the tail end of his addiction, he was addicted to fentanyl and all of the drugs along the way. And my understanding, based on listening to different doctors and Dr. Gabor Mehta and so on and so forth,
Yeah.
is trauma plays a significant role. But when your brain gets rewired by addiction, the drugs take the first position in terms of survival for you. And so if you are thinking through that lens of I need to survive and therefore I must have, that's why we see what we would consider like crazy behavior from people who are in addiction mode, that if they were in recovery mode, that is absolutely not who they are. And people don't understand that, like, it's very confusing for a lot of people to better understand this. But I love the emphasis on really this is about connection. And as you were talking, what I was also thinking, Paul, was that in order to be able to kind of lean into connection, we absolutely on all sides need to lay down the shame that keeps us isolated in
Yeah.
order to be courageous enough to want to move in the direction of connection.
I agree with you 100%. And in my experience, again, what's really interesting, especially when I'm working with men, is when we start to look at that shame,
Mm-hmm.
almost always the root of that shame, if you follow the thread, if you will, to mix
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
metaphors, is some story that actually they can't place a finger on where it began. The shame doesn't actually start within them. It was planted by somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Either they saw it out in society, they've learned something in different places. But when you get right down to the shame and the root of it, and they start to understand, they lands nowhere. It's
Mm-hmm.
born nowhere. And so
Mm-hmm.
understanding that that is a story, that your shame is born mostly from a story that you
Mm-hmm.
have learned
Mm-hmm.
and that can be unlearned. And that the beautiful thing about it being a
Mm-hmm.
story is that
Mm-hmm.
there is so much that is possible within
Mm-hmm.
story. So one of my favorite questions right now, whether I'm working with men or whether I'm
Mm-hmm.
working in grief, is what else is possible?
Right, right.
What else is possible? Okay, that
Yeah,
might be true. This is your shame. That might be true. What
yeah,
else is possible?
yeah, yeah. Well, I love the connectivity to story and the idea that whatever our story is around shame is that it was born someplace else. And
Hmm.
I do firmly believe that there's kind of a pool of thought that
Hmm.
from our
Yes.
families to our communities to our schools, all of the things. And I will routinely say to my clients, is that your thought? And
Right.
actually think about that. And then do you want to keep that thought or do you want to boot that
That's
thought?
right. That's right. That's right. And you're making me think of too, I'm blessed to be working with a couple of young people right now, which is something I don't have a lot of opportunity to do. But this one young person in particular, there's a lot of questioning about what is actually her voice
Yes.
versus the voices of others.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm really encouraging them to do is when
Mm-hmm.
they hear their voice, to act out on it and then
Mm-hmm.
to see what that experience is like. Because if
Mm-hmm.
that experience actually felt good to them and was
Mm-hmm.
nourishing and was fulfilling, then
Mm-hmm.
there's a good chance that it was their voice.
Mm-hmm.
But if it was not, then it's, well, what else might be possible? What
Mm-hmm.
else might you have chosen? What would your voice have actually looked like? Or what would
Mm-hmm.
it have wanted to offer yourself in that moment?
Yes. Yes. And so for parents or loved ones of addiction, people dealing with addiction or substance use disorder, it's what's the story you're telling yourself? And are you open to rewriting the story in a way that serves you and serves them?
Yeah, I mean, that sentence applies to so many parts of our lives. Our beliefs, right? Our beliefs
Mm-hmm.
is another thing. And if I tie it here with, well, you can think of it as well around some belief systems will have it that if you die from in a certain way, that what comes after leads you to a certain experience, which is not always the thing that is desirable, but that's a belief. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
things I truly believe about beliefs, to not to overuse the word in one
Yeah,
sentence,
sure, sure.
but is that those beliefs are there to help guide us and help us navigate life, but they're also there to be challenged and questioned because
Mm-hmm.
beliefs should be in service to the most full life for yourself. If a belief drives you to fear, if a belief drives you to resistance then I'm not sure it's a belief. It might be something more like story or dogma.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, if something is driving you into a place of fear, then there's almost certainly another belief that's possible to you that would serve and support you and that brings you closer to love, right? That brings you closer
Yes,
to that
yes,
softer
yes.
experience.
And so I am a big student of brain science and then the notion
Mm.
of brain stem, fear, fight,
Hmm.
flight, or freeze, fawn, all of those things, but also the neocortex, which I'm a big student of positive intelligence by Sharad Samin, Shamin, and fear resides down here.
Hmm.
Love resides up here. And generally speaking, if you are in a darker emotion, you're down here. And curiosity, empathy, clarity is up here. And so,
Hmm.
what I'm asking people to do is to entertain the notion of being curious and empathetic
Hmm.
to somebody who's dealing with addiction and
Hmm.
yourself,
Yeah.
and to live in those two areas so that potentially you might get clearer about what's actually taking place. And what I would say to you, Paul, too, is I'm very clear that the story I'm telling you right now is just shit I'm making up. And it serves me and it has served a lot of my clients. And so I'm willing to continue to lean into the stories that I tell that serve us all at a higher level.
Absolutely. I mean, I usually start one of my, if I'm working, especially in groups, because I do a lot of community work in groups and things like that, I always tell
Mm-hmm.
people I have no answers. I have a lot of questions, and
Mm-hmm.
together, your questions and my questions, let's wonder and wander together and see what we come across. And
Mm-hmm.
if we do come across anything that does feel more nourishing and supportive, let's maybe test it out. Let's give it a run and see what that looks like for us in our lives. Because again, to come back to the place where I spend most of my time today around death, I mean, we have been presented with this visual of death, right? Literally, in some cases, the Grim Reaper is a great example. It's a very dark, it's very evil, it's foreboding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Keep evil
Mm-hmm.
at bay. We want to
Mm-hmm.
fight death, right?
Mm-hmm.
All of these
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one perspective, but it's the only perspective we're really offered. And my invitation is always to just shift the chair a little bit over to the right or
Mm-hmm.
to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And that thing that you're looking at fundamentally is going to offer you more of itself, a different way
Mm-hmm.
of being seen. And so everything from addiction to grief to even growth, right? And
Mm-hmm.
production and success, all of these things really are looking for us to look at them in all of the ways. They want to be experienced in all the different ways.
Yeah.
And then we choose the one that serves us in the most
Mm-hmm.
meaningful way.
Yes. And if you become a student of grief and look around the world, you begin to open doors and windows about how other cultures view death, how other cultures grieve. And so it can be so illuminating.
Incredibly.
Yes, absolutely. And so if we can get out of our own little paradigm that we have been kind of raised up in the Western world, generally speaking, and begin to expand and be students of other ways of being in the world and experiencing the world and framing the world and all of it, allow us to live more joyfully, more inspired, more present in the world that is ours.
Absolutely. I mean, so I'm from a part of the world known largely as today as like England and Wales and
Hmm.
northern France, right? And we don't have a tagline for our ceremonies around death like the Irish do,
Hmm.
but white, male from the Western civilization.
Hmm.
And most people are very familiar with the energy and the celebration that comes at an Irish wake. So we
Hmm.
don't even have to look to cultures that don't look like ours in
Hmm.
order to know that there is something else available to us in these moments. And of
Hmm.
course, they come with the sadness too, but there's so much celebration.
Right.
And again, our language is so important. Like
Yeah.
the minute we start saying lost or past, there's a void, there's a transgression. In the losing, there's a transgression. We have done
Hmm.
something. I lost my mom means I've done something to her.
Hmm.
Even though that's not actually what we're saying,
Hmm.
energetically, words have
Hmm.
power
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
matters. And when you say past, it's leave behind, no
Hmm.
longer a part of my current or future experience. And those words matter and it's really important. And so I really do as much as I can. And I will slip every now and again and I will say
Hmm.
past and I will say lost. But as much as possible, I encourage people to just embrace the fact that your loved one has died and that is more than okay. That is the thing that feeds life,
Hmm.
that through their dying, they're feeding life. And so, can we find the beauty? Can we find the beauty in it? And I'll give you an
Yeah.
example of where you can see the beauty really
Yeah.
physically. And it
Yeah.
may be something for people to take away as we probably come to the end of our time. But if you think about a plant, or you think about a flower, right? That flowering is actually the signal of death. So at its height, at its apex, its most beautiful, it is
Mm-hmm.
preparing to die. The next thing that will happen is it will wither and die and fall to the ground. But then what does it do? It goes
Mm-hmm.
back into the ground and it feeds more life. So when that flower is at its most beautiful, that is the signal that death is very, very, very near. And what if we looked at our life that way?
Wow. We could talk for another couple hours.
And my jaw enjoys it. I love doing this kind of thing. I really appreciate the opportunity. So, would that more of
Absolutely.
us do this? Would that more of us do this?
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's another reason because, I said earlier, Sam is almost 3 years clean and sober and living a great life and all the things, and working his program and so on and so forth. And I've had numbers of people say to me, well, why are you doing the podcast?
Hmm.
And I'm like, because I get to meet extraordinary people and have
Hmm.
incredible conversations that range in all different directions. I am never the same on the other side of a conversation. And I feel up leveled every time I have one of these conversations. And so for that, I want to say how grateful I am to have had this conversation with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Hmm.
we didn't do it. I wanted to do it before, but can we take a moment and just celebrate Sam in 3 years?
Oh,
Like,
absolutely. Yes.
like
Woohoo.
as as a man, we don't take enough time celebrating our wins, right? This
Hmm.
is something else we know. And so I
Hmm.
want to make sure we take the time and
Hmm.
celebrate his win. That's such a
Hmm.
beautiful, beautiful thing to hear.
It's incredible. And then to watch the evolution of his unfolding,
Yes.
and then to kind of bookmark all these moments back when he was in addiction mode where I thought the life that he's living now, he would never be able to live. And so that was a lie.
Yeah.
And it brought me grief and
Hmm.
despair and hopelessness. And so just to kind of put a pin on the idea of stories that we tell ourselves, that in
Yeah.
fact, in his story, absolutely did not come true.
And
Mm-hmm.
I hope at some point, maybe if Sam and I ever get a chance, or if he gets in touch with this with somebody else, with the grief of that life that he led under the sort of umbrella of addiction, may
Mm-hmm.
that be something that he grieves with that same love as
Mm-hmm.
it informs his life going
Mm-hmm.
forward.
Mm-hmm.
Like, love that part of your life, love
Mm-hmm.
that part of yourself because it's shaped him to who he is today.
Yes, and he's a magnificent man.
There you are.
And wise, wise, wise beyond his years because of that journey. So thank you for wanting to celebrate him.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you
Hmm.
for sharing his story.
Absolutely.
Probably
Yeah.
again. I'm sure it's not the first time.
Oh, yeah. So if anybody in the audience wants to get a hold of you, how might they reach you?
So all of my work is paulsimard.co,
Mhm.
not .com,
Okay.
.co. And you can also find me on all the usual socials, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. And I'm very accessible. If you see a phone number somewhere, that's my cell phone. So
Okay.
people want to reach out by text. My
Mm.
email is everywhere as well. So I'm very, very accessible. And whether it's to support them or to just have a conversation like this one. I think this is the most important thing we can do
Mhm.
is
Yes.
have these kinds of conversations and
Hmm.
let's gather around the fire and do it more often.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we will have all of that information in the show notes, along with your speaker sheet, bio, profile, all the
Thank you.
things, including your TED Talk link. And again, so I just want to say how grateful I am that you reached out to us and we've connected. And truly, thank you for the work that you're doing in the world. We
Thank
need
you.
more and more men like you.
Thank you. Well, I'll be happy with just more and more people. Let's just get more and more people like you and me. And again, let's just keep going. So thank
Just keep
you.
multiplying.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Okay. Everybody take care. Remember, thrive.